Assenois, Belgium. 10 minutes before 5 in the afternoon, the 26th of December, 1944. A frozen secondary road, and a machine weighing nearly 40 tons, running flat out through German fire. Its name is Cobra King. 5 Americans are inside. 3 days earlier, this crew had a different commander. His name was Charles Trover, and a sniper killed him in that same turret, on the exact patch of steel where Lieutenant Bogus is standing now. Their orders are simple and insane. Do not stop. Ahead of them, dug into the tree line, is the German ring around Bastogne, where the men of the 101st Airborne have been surrounded, shelled, and frozen for days. Behind Cobra King, 4 Shermans are already burning. Here is what nobody in that snow knew. Not Bogus, not the paratroopers, not the Germans watching their ring crack open. Under the armor of that tank, dragging 10 tons of extra steel through ice and gunfire, sat 18 liters of aluminum. A V8 with double overhead camshafts and 32 valves. Technology Ford would not sell to ordinary customers for another half-century. An engine so advanced it seems impossible for 1944. And it was never supposed to exist. That engine is a leftover. The surviving 2/3 of an aircraft engine that the United States military looked at, evaluated, and rejected. An orphan, born out of an old man's temper, and salvaged with a saw. So here is the question this story has to answer. How does a mistake break a siege? In May of 1940, the German army did something that military planners across the world had considered impossible. It took France in 6 weeks. France was not a minor power. Its army was rated among the strongest on earth. It sat behind fortifications that had cost a fortune and the confidence of an entire generation. And it came apart in a month and a half, undone by columns of armor, moving faster than anyone believed armor could move. In Washington, men watched the newsreels in darkened rooms and understood 2 things in the same moment. America was going to need tanks. And America had almost none. In July of 1940, the War Department authorized a new medium tank and the country's first real armored divisions. Then it walked straight into a problem hiding underneath the obvious one. A modern medium tank weighs somewhere around 30 tons. To move that weight the way the German columns had moved, over broken ground, through mud, up grades, hour after hour, it needs somewhere between 400 and 500 horsepower. Now look at what American industry actually built in 1940. Car engines, 60 horsepower, 80, 100 if the buyer paid extra. Truck diesels were not much better, slow and heavy, and designed for flat highway hauling. There was exactly one category of machine in the United States that produced the kind of power a tank required: aircraft engines. And every single one of them was already promised to airplanes. So the Army improvised. It took a 9-cylinder Wright Whirlwind radial, a genuine airplane power plant built by Continental, under license from Wright, stood it upright inside a tank hull, and called it a tank motor. It worked, more or less. It also meant the hull had to be tall enough to wrap itself around a spinning circle of cylinders, which is where American tanks got that high, boxy silhouette that German gunners would come to appreciate at long range. It meant tank factories competing for parts with the aircraft industry that the country desperately needed. And it meant a power plant with a habit of fouling the spark plugs in its bottom cylinders because oil in a radial obeys gravity even when nobody wants it to. A crew learns about that habit at inconvenient moments, usually in the dark. Usually when someone is waiting for them somewhere else. Understand what that means to the 5 men inside. A tank crew does not experience an engine as a specification on a page. They experience it as a sound. They sleep beside it, they thaw their hands on it, and they learn its voice the way a farmer learns the voice of an animal. A healthy note means the machine will start in the morning. A rough note at midnight means somebody is going to spend the next 4 hours flat on his back in frozen mud with a wrench, while the rest of the column pulls away without him. Every hour a tank spends being repaired is an hour it is not somewhere on a map, and in a war of movement, the map is the entire argument. That was the state of things in the summer of 1940, a famine dressed up as a program. And a few weeks before the War Department ever signed that authorization, a telephone had already rung in Dearborn. In June of 1940, with the Battle of Britain only weeks away, the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, opened talks with Edsel Ford. Edsel was 46 years old, the president of the Ford Motor Company, and by every account the most reasonable man in the building. The proposal was enormous. Ford would mass-produce the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the finest liquid-cooled aircraft engine in existence, the heart of the Spitfire. 9,000 of them, 6,000 for Britain, 3,000 for the United States. Edsel said yes. Charles Sorensen, the production chief who had spent his life turning drawings into moving assembly lines, said yes. Blueprints crossed the Atlantic. A sample Merlin was delivered to Dearborn and set down on a bench where Ford engineers could put their hands on it. Picture that room. Men who had spent their entire working lives making things cheap and making them fast, standing around an engine assembled by British craftsmen who filed and scraped and fitted each part to its neighbor by feel. It was beautiful. It was also, to a Detroit production man, almost offensive. Sorensen's people did not look at it and see a masterpiece. They looked at it and saw 1,000 operations that could be done by machine, and a delivery schedule that could be cut in half, and men who could be trained in a week instead of a decade. In the American war effort, in the summer that Britain stood alone, this was as close to a settled thing as anything got. Then Henry Ford found out where those engines were going. The founder was 76 years old. He was isolationist down to the bone, and he still held absolute power over the company that carried his name, no matter whose signature was on the paperwork. At the beginning of July, he killed the agreement his own son had made. His stated reason was simple and public. 6 of every 10 Merlins were bound for British use, and Ford would build for the defense of the United States, and for nothing else. William Knudsen, the former Ford production man whom Roosevelt had placed in charge of war procurement, was in the middle of it. So was every other official who understood what the loss of 9,000 engines meant to a country that had none to spare. None of it moved the old man. And this is the first strange turn in a story built entirely out of strange turns. That contract, $130 million of it, went down the road to the Packard Motor Car Company. In September of 1940, Rolls-Royce and Packard signed. Packard-built Merlins would eventually go into the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that escorted American bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and which more than one historian has called the decisive aircraft of the European Air War. Henry Ford's worst decision of 1940 handed the United States one of its greatest aircraft engines. Not because he intended it, as a side effect of a tantrum. Remember that shape. It is about to happen again, on the ground, with much higher stakes. There is a bitter footnote the old man never enjoyed hearing. Ford's own British subsidiary at Trafford Park, outside Manchester, went on to build roughly 30,000 Merlins, with a workforce that reached 17,000 people. Ford built the Merlin after all. It simply built it for Britain, in Britain, with the founder's name on the gate and none of his approval inside it. Back in Dearborn, though, pride wanted an answer. If Ford would not copy the British masterpiece, then Ford would beat it. Through late 1940 and into 1941, the company's engineers designed a brand new liquid-cooled aircraft engine from a blank sheet of paper, 12 cylinders, and they gave it a bore of 5.402 inches and a stroke of 6 inches. Write those two numbers down somewhere. Because the Merlin's bore was 5.4 inches, and the Merlin's stroke was 6 inches. Ford's engineers, forbidden to build the British engine, sat down and drew cylinders of exactly the same size. Everything else was a swing for the fences, an all-aluminum block in an era when engines were made of cast iron. Double overhead camshafts on each bank, 4 camshafts in total, where the Merlin made do with 2, 4 valves in every cylinder. Provision for an exhaust-driven supercharger. And unlike the British engine, which was largely hand-fitted by craftsmen, this one was drawn from the first day for volume. Built around castings that a Detroit line could pour by the thousand. It was aimed at the very top of its class. By the summer of 1941, prototypes were running on test stands in Michigan, bolted down, howling into the roof beams, watched by men with clipboards who believed they were listening to the future of American aviation. And here is where the word in our title walks into the story. Nobody in the American military had asked for this machine. No requirement existed for it. No contract waited for it. There was no customer, no program, no letter of intent. It was a monument to one company's wounded ego. 12 cylinders of pure spite, built on speculation, for a buyer that Ford simply assumed would appear once they saw what it could do. You can probably guess what the buyer said. The Navy flew radials and had no interest in a liquid-cooled engine of any kind. The Army Air Corps already had the Allison V-1710 in mass production, with warehouses of spare parts and thousands of trained mechanics behind it, and now had Packard's Merlin coming as well. A third liquid-cooled engine, from a company that had never certified an aircraft power plant of its own, solved a problem that no longer existed. Dearborn was already building Pratt & Whitney radials under license. As far as the Air Forces were concerned, that was Ford's job in this war, and Ford should get on with it. So the answer came back. No. 12 cylinders. Some of the most advanced piston engine thinking on the continent. Aluminum where everyone else used iron. 32 valves where everyone else used 16. Drawn for mass production in a country that was about to need mass production more than it had ever needed anything. And not one aircraft on Earth would ever fly behind it. In almost any other system, in almost any other country, this is where the story ends. A dead program. A write-off. A cautionary tale about old men and pride, filed away in a cabinet and forgotten. Instead, it is where the story begins. Because at that exact moment, on the other side of the same army, the tank men were drowning. And one of them was about to walk into that factory, look at Ford's orphan, and ask a question that no engineer would ever ask on purpose. By early 1942, the Army's tank program was eating itself. Sherman orders were doubling, and then doubling again. Every hull coming off every line needed a heart, and the heart it needed was a right radial that the aviation industry needed more. The Ordnance Department did the arithmetic and arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. America could build tanks faster than it could find engines to put in them. New suppliers had to be created out of whatever existed, which is how Army officers ended up standing in Dearborn, looking at a dead aircraft engine and asking Ford a question that sounds like the opening line of a joke. We do not need another 12 for airplanes. Could you make us an 8 for tanks? What happened next is one of the most beautifully crude acts of engineering in American history. Ford's people took the existing design, the drawings, the casting cores, the tooling that had already been ordered on speculation, and they amputated the rear 4 cylinders. Not a redesign. A cut. That distinction is the whole reason this story exists. A redesign means years. Years of drawings, years of new tooling, years of proving out castings, years the country did not have. A cut meant months. Keeping everything else exactly as it was meant that a factory could start pouring metal almost immediately. So almost nothing changed. The all-aluminum construction carried over. So did the strange, narrow 60-degree angle between the cylinder banks, an angle that makes perfect sense for a 12 and no sense at all for an 8. That angle is a fingerprint. It is a V12's geometry, carried on a V8's block, and it would confuse engine builders for the next 60 years. And the cylinders themselves carried over. 5.402 inches of bore, 6 inches of stroke. The 2 numbers you were asked to remember. The Merlin's own dimensions, chosen in spite in 1940, now bound for the mud. 8 of those cylinders add up to 1,100 cubic inches, 18 liters. To this day, it remains the largest gasoline V8 Ford ever built. They called it the Ford GAA. Now let me show you what the Army actually received, because on paper it makes no sense for 1942. Double overhead camshafts, 32 valves, 2 carburetors, 2 magnetos feeding 2 spark plugs in every single cylinder, a completely doubled ignition system, so that half the electrical side of the engine could die in the field and the machine would keep running long enough to get 5 men behind a tree line. No belts anywhere, no chains anywhere. Every accessory driven by gears, because gears do not stretch in the heat and they do not snap in a Belgian winter, and a rubber belt that fails at the wrong moment turns a fighting vehicle into a very expensive rock. Ford would not sell an ordinary customer a 32-valve V8 until the 1990s. Tank crews got one in 1942. The rated output was 500 horsepower at 2,600 revolutions per minute, and underneath that headline number sat the figure that actually mattered in a field in France. Roughly 1,050 pound-feet of torque, arriving at 2,200 revolutions, which in practical terms meant a wall of pulling force available almost the instant a driver's boot came down. Horsepower is what a machine can do when it is already moving. Torque is what it can do from a standstill, with mud up to its road wheels, with a hedgerow in front of it and a gun barrel swinging toward it. But here is the reveal that this entire story turns on, and I want to slow down and say it precisely. This machine was conceived for the sky. Its designers sized every bearing, every valve spring, every casting wall, every stud and journal and oil gallery for an aircraft's life. That means running at full output for hours without a break. That means clawing at thin air at high altitude where cooling is poor and detonation waits. That means no margin for a single missed beat, because an aircraft engine that stops has killed everyone attached to it. Then the sky said no, and the exact same hardware was handed a job that asked for a fraction of that ambition. A governor was bolted on, and the whole thing was capped at 2,600 revolutions per minute. Remember that number. Think about what that actually means for every component inside. Every part in that engine was now living at a small fraction of the stress it had been born to survive. In engineering language, the power plant was massively derated. In plain language, it was an Olympic athlete assigned to walk a mile route. Machines like that do not wear out. They loaf. They run for 30 years and ask what else you have. So let me close the first half of this story's argument right here, in plain words. The Air Corps rejection did not merely spare this engine. The rejection is what created it. Because no nation on Earth designs a tank engine to aircraft standards on purpose. The cost is absurd. The precision is wasted. The aluminum is needed elsewhere. Every accountant in every war ministry, in every capital would kill it in the first meeting, and every one of them would be right to. An overbuilt heart like that could only reach a tank by accident. And now you can see what the mistake in our title actually was. Not the machine's creation, its demotion. Hold that number, 2,600. In about a year, engineers in another country are going to write a very similar number on a chalkboard for exactly the opposite reason, and that contrast is going to decide battles. Production of the engine began at the old Lincoln plant on Warren Avenue, on the west side of Detroit. There is a small piece of poetry in that address. The Lincoln plant had been raised by Henry Leland during the First World War to build Liberty aircraft engines. The building had come full circle. Born to make warplane hearts, reborn to make a warplane heart that drove on tracks. Before the line stopped, nearly 21,000 of these V8s came out of that plant, and more than 28,000 counting the whole family of variants that grew out of it. Every one of them built from interchangeable parts, so that a component pulled out of a crate in Belgium fit a block cast in Michigan without a file being lifted. That last sentence sounds like a footnote. It is not. It is the difference between an army and a parking lot. One man at the center of all this never saw any of it bear fruit. Edsel Ford, the son who had said yes to the Merlin and been overruled, the quiet force who dragged the company into bombers at Willow Run and into war production on every front, often against his father's instincts and always at his father's expense, was dying through the whole thing. Stomach cancer took him on the 26th of May, 1943. He was 49 years old. He never saw Normandy. He never saw what the orphaned engine became. He never got to stand in a room and hear anyone admit that he had been right. The old man got the headlines. The son got the war built. There were a great many men like Edsel Ford in those years. Men who lost the argument, and then poured themselves into the work anyway, and history filed them under their fathers' names. If you believe the people who built these machines deserve remembering alongside the people who rode them, hitting the like button is a small act of memory. It costs nothing. Being forgotten already cost them enough. Meanwhile, the Army now had a problem that success had created. The Sherman was not getting one heart. It was getting 5. Here is a fact that sounds like a quartermaster's nightmare, because it was one. America built its main battle tank with 5 different, unrelated power plants. Same hull, same gun, same turret. 5 completely different engines underneath. Because in 1942, the fear of running out of engines outweighed the fear of chaos. The M4 and the M4A1 kept the tall aircraft radial. The M4A2 married 2 General Motors truck diesels side by side and went mostly to the Marine Corps and to Lend-Lease. The M4A3 got the Ford. And then there was the M4A4, which deserves a moment of silence. Chrysler, ordered to produce power out of whatever already existed, took 5 ordinary automobile engines and bolted them around a common gear ring. 30 cylinders, 5 carburetors, 5 distributors, 5 of everything, all of it needing to be in tune at the same moment, in a hull, in a war. It was a mechanic's fever dream. It actually ran, and it went, wisely, mostly to the British. 1 chassis, 5 species. The Army was about to find out which of them it could trust. The Ford's audition was unlike anything the others faced, because ordnance did something quietly remarkable with it. The Ford-powered version came to the fighting later than its rivals, after a long stretch of service inside the United States, on the logic that a brand new power plant should have its bugs beaten out of it by instructors rather than by men under fire. Hold that thought too. Compare it in a moment to what another army did with its own brand new tank. Then came the trials. In 1943, Ford-powered tanks were run against their rivals until things broke. The results are worth stating exactly, because they are less dramatic and more convincing than the legend. The Ford engines averaged 255 hours of operation. The General Motors diesels averaged 225. The radials averaged 218. That is not a miracle. That is a margin. And one of the Ford engines failed at 87 hours. I want that number in this story, because a story that only reports the good numbers is not history, it is advertising. Some of these engines broke. Some of them broke early. Men in the field would have cursed them by name. But the examiners noted 2 things that the raw averages do not show. When a Ford engine did fail, it could usually be returned to service by replacing a single component. And of everything they tested, the Ford was judged the easiest of all to work on. 3 of the test vehicles were pulled out of the trials entirely, at 187 hours, at 247, and at 295, for reasons that had nothing to do with their engines. By June of 1943, the verdict was on paper. Ordnance testing declared the Ford superior to any other medium tank power plant then available. And the recommendations that followed tell you exactly how much the Army believed its own data. Build up stocks of the Ford-powered tanks in every theater. Phase the radial versions out. And reserve the Ford-powered machines for United States troops. Read that last part again. The Diesels went to the Allies. The Frankenstein went to Britain. The Radials went wherever they were needed. And the V8, born out of a rejection nobody wanted, America kept for itself. Of the whole Sherman family, this became the American branch. 12,596 of them built, across 3 factories, between June of 1942 and June of 1945, the version that would carry the Army to the Rhine. So there is the next piece of the argument delivered straight. By the middle of 1943, an engine that nobody had ordered, from a program that had already failed once, had formally beaten every purpose-chosen rival in the United States arsenal. And if the story ended there, it would be a tidy little engineering fable. It does not end there, because in the summer of 1944, in the hedgerows of Normandy, the machine carrying that engine ran into the Panther and the Tiger and acquired the ugliest reputation in American military history. Lieutenant Colonel William Lovelady commanded a battalion in the 3rd Armored Division. Accounts preserved by his own division tell of one of his crews rounding the corner of a house and finding itself face to face with a Panther and putting 3 rounds into its front plate. All 3 bounced. The German gun did not bounce. Crews learned that lesson across France at the cost of friends, and they started calling their own machines names that no army wants to hear its men using. And here I have to stop and correct something you have almost certainly heard, because this story only works if we are honest, even when the honesty is inconvenient. You have been told that British crews called the Sherman a Ronson, after the cigarette lighter that lights first time, every time. It is the single most repeated line in the history of this tank, and no wartime source for it has ever been found. Not in a prisoner interrogation, not in a war diary, not in a unit journal, not in a single period recording. The lighter company's famous slogan did not even appear until after the war was over. The nickname appears to have drifted backward out of post-war writing and settled into everyone's memory as if it had always been there. The men had real complaints. They did not need an invented one. And a young ordnance lieutenant in that same 3rd Armored, a man named Belton Cooper, spent his war dragging shattered hulls back from the line at night and cataloging what he found inside them. Decades later, he put those memories into a book, and he titled it Death Traps. His division landed in Normandy with 232 tanks. By the end of the war, it had lost 648 destroyed outright, with roughly 700 more knocked out and repaired, a loss rate, by his own arithmetic, of 580%. Sit with those numbers for a moment. They are true. So is the grief inside them. Every one of those 648 was somebody's mourning. Then let us do the thing that honest history requires, and audit them. First, the burning. Army investigators traced the fires not to the gasoline and not to the Ford engine, but to the ammunition. Dozens of propellant charges stored in bins along the sides of the fighting compartment, waiting for a fragment. Early Shermans, when penetrated, burned somewhere between 60 and 80% of the time. That is a terrible number. It is also, according to the Tank Museum's own assessment, broadly similar to other tanks of the period. One Allied study found that the Panzer IV actually caught fire more often than the Sherman did. Steel boxes full of explosives burn. That is the tragedy of the profession, and it was not an American invention. The American difference is what happened next. The flaw was acknowledged, engineered against, and fixed in the middle of a world war. From February of 1944, new hulls carried what was called wet stowage. The ammunition was moved down into the floor and surrounded by bins jacketed with a water and glycerine mixture, so that a penetration would flood the propellant instead of igniting it. A United States Army study afterward found that wet stowage Shermans burned only 10 to 15% of the time when penetrated, against the 60 to 80% of the older dry stowage machines. The Army did not defend its mistake. It deleted it, in wartime, while the line was still running. Second, look again at Cooper's own arithmetic. 648 destroyed. and roughly 700 knocked out, repaired, and sent back. His maintenance crews were resurrecting armor by morning, over and over, because the design was built to be fixed, and because the parts always fit. A crew could be issued a machine at dusk that had been a casualty at dawn. The men who did that work never appear in a single film about this war. And third, quietly underneath everything, notice what never appears in those loss columns: the engine. Whatever else went wrong in Normandy, and a great deal went wrong, columns did not stand still because Fords stopped turning. That is the honest shape of it. Unstoppable was never a promise about one hull surviving one shell. It was a property of the herd. The side whose armor is still running gets to decide where the battle happens, and how often, and with what odds. Which raises the question this whole audit has been circling. Germany could build the most feared guns and the thickest armor of the war. Daimler, Maybach, Porsche. The very civilization that invented the internal combustion engine. Why could it not build hearts to match? The answer is not talent. To see it, we have to go back 1 year, before Normandy, to a wheat field in Russia. And we have to pick up the thought I asked you to hold earlier about an army that kept its newest engine at home for a year so that instructors could break it instead of soldiers. Because in July of 1943, at Kursk, Germany introduced the tank that would terrify Allied crews for the rest of the war. And it did the exact opposite. The introduction was a catastrophe that almost nobody talks about. 200 brand new Panthers were rushed east to the 10th Panzer Brigade. By 8 o'clock on the morning of the 5th of July, before the offensive had properly begun, 16 of them had already broken down. By the evening of the 7th of July, 2 days into the most important German operation of the year, the brigade had 7 combat-ready tanks. 7 out of 200. By the evening of the 10th of July, there were 10 Panthers facing the enemy. 25 had been written off completely. 23 of them hit and burned, and 2 of them burned during the march to the front without meeting an enemy at all. And 100 of them sat in the workshops. 56 with damage from guns and mines. 44 with nothing wrong except that they had broken. Heinz Guderian, the general responsible for Germany's armor, had begged Hitler not to launch the operation. Afterward, he was the one who had to write the assessment, explaining where the wonder weapon had gone. Now remember the number I asked you to hold: 2,600. Here's the other side of that mirror. Late in 1943, Maybach began fitting the Panther's engine with a governor of its own, capping it at 2,500 revolutions per minute, and cutting its output from 700 metric horsepower down to 600. The same trick, the opposite meaning. Dearborn's governor was protecting an enormous surplus. It was an aircraft heart forbidden to use most of itself, and the forbidding is what kept it alive. Maybach's governor was a plea for mercy on an overdrawn account. 23 liters of iron squeezed to 700 at its absolute limit, now begging to be allowed to make 600 instead, so that it might live a little longer. One engine was throttled because it had too much. The other was throttled because it had nothing left. After the war, the French inherited hundreds of Panthers and ran them honestly, off-road, uphill, in the rain, the way soldiers actually run machines. Their regiment operated them until 1949, which gave the French almost twice as much time in a Panther as any German formation ever had. Their 1947 report is one of the quietly most brutal documents in armored history. The final drive, it found, had an average fatigue life of 150 kilometers. 150 kilometers. Roughly 2 hours of hard driving between a factory fresh drivetrain and a tow cable. And the same report noted something that should have ended the argument forever. Half of the Panthers found abandoned in Normandy had not been shot at all. Their final drives had failed. Half of them, the most feared tank in Europe, sitting in French fields, killed by its own gearbox. So we arrive at the why, and talent was never the shortage. German engineers were among the finest alive. The Panther was designed at the limit. Every gear, every bearing, loaded to the very edge of what its metal could bear, because the specification demanded miracles and the specification always won. Its final drive used simple straight-cut gears running at stresses no peacetime engineer would put his name to. American drives, by contrast, used double rows of herringbone teeth loafing far below their limits. One system built margins and called it prudence. The other spent its margins on paper performance and called it excellence. And behind that sat something larger. Germany had no machinery for catching its own accidents. When a German design failed, there was no idle Packard down the street to hand it to. No orphaned masterpiece, waiting in a rival's warehouse with the tooling already paid for. The Reich system converted its errors into shortages. The American system, as you have now watched across this entire story, converted its errors into engines. And Germany's own leadership could see the result coming over the horizon. In November of 1944, after a trip to the Italian front, the Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, wrote it down in an official report. The Sherman Tank, he said, climbs mountains that German panzer crews consider impassable. And then he gave the reason, in language that could have been lifted straight out of a Ford engineering memo. This is accomplished, he wrote, by the especially powerful engine in the Sherman in comparison to its weight. The armaments minister of the Third Reich, describing the American advantage and putting his finger on an aircraft engine that the United States Army Air Corps had thrown away. 1 month later, Germany bet everything on the assumption that none of it mattered. On the 16th of December 1944, the Ardennes offensive threw the last armored reserves of the Third Reich into a 100-mile dash for Antwerp. Panthers whose final drives averaged 150 kilometers of life. King Tigers that weighed as much as 2 Shermans, all of them with fuel tanks that were half empty before they started, gambling on captured American gasoline somewhere along the way. It was the boldest thing they could have done, and it was arithmetic they could not win. 3 days later, in a cold headquarters at Verdun, Eisenhower asked his generals what could be done for a surrounded Belgian town called Bastogne, where the men of the 101st Airborne were holding a perimeter in the snow with what they had in their pockets. George Patton answered that he could disengage his entire Third Army from a battle it was already fighting, turn it 90 degrees, and attack north with 3 divisions within days. Most accounts agree that some men in that room thought he was performing. He was not performing. He was doing arithmetic. He was calculating which army's machines could be relied upon to finish a long march in winter and still be able to fight at the end of it. It is the least romantic calculation in the history of warfare, and on that particular week it was the only one that mattered. His columns turned in the ice and went north, off the march and straight into the attack. By the afternoon of the 26th of December, the 4th Armored Division had been fighting north for 4 days, against dug-in paratroopers, against minefields, against cold that welds skin to steel and turns every simple task into an argument with your own hands. The lead battalions, Creighton Abrams and his 37th Tank Battalion, alongside the 53rd Armored Infantry, were still short of Bastogne, and the daylight was dying. The plan called for a careful, methodical advance. Abrams looked at the map and looked at the light and decided to stop being careful. They would gamble everything on a narrow secondary road running through Clochimont and Assenois, a road the Germans held, but did not expect anyone to use. Artillery was called down on Assenois itself, and into the smoke leading the company went the machine you met in the first minute of this story. Cobra King was not an ordinary Sherman. It was an M4A3E2, the Jumbo, one of only 254 assault variants ever built, produced at the Fisher Tank Arsenal across a few short months in the spring and summer of 1944, when somebody in ordnance decided the Army needed a Sherman that could take a hit and keep going. Its frontal protection was roughly doubled. Its weight swelled toward 40 tons. 10 extra tons of steel that its engine had never been redesigned to carry. Nobody upgraded the V8 for the Jumbo program. Nobody had to. Remember the Olympic athlete assigned to walk a mail route. On a frozen road outside Bastogne, somebody finally handed him something heavy. And all of that wasted aircraft excess, every pound-foot that a sane accountant would have deleted from the drawings in 1941, every ounce of margin that existed only because the Air Corps had said no, got spent in 25 minutes of snow and gunfire. You know the rest of it from the beginning. Lieutenant Charles Bogus in the turret. Corporal Milton Dickerman on the gun, firing so continuously that the loader could not keep ahead of him. Private James Murphy feeding shells until the floor of the fighting compartment rang. Private Hubert Smith driving, hands locked on the levers, told only to keep the throttle open. Private Harold Hafner at the bow gun, working the tree line. 4 machines burning behind them on the road. Then the pillbox. Then the smoke thinning. Then the last 4 miles opening up in front of a single tank at full throttle, with an entire American division somewhere behind and 18,000 men somewhere ahead. At around 10 minutes before 5 in the afternoon, Cobra King reached a line of foxholes. Figures in American uniforms came up out of the snow, moving carefully, because nobody in that perimeter had trusted the sound of an engine in a week. A lieutenant of the 326th Airborne Engineers walked up to the tank and put out his hand. "I am Lieutenant Dwayne Webster," he said, 326th Airborne Engineers. "We are mighty glad to see you." The siege of Bastogne was broken. Within the hour, Abrams himself was shaking hands with General McAuliffe inside the perimeter. And the only open road into Bastogne ran back down the route that Bogus and his crew had cleared. 4 miles. That was the whole of it. 4 miles at the end of a march that had begun in another battle, in another part of France, against the advice of almost everyone. Now pull the camera back from those 4 miles and look at what was happening to the rest of the German gamble at the same hour. The spearheads that were supposed to reach Antwerp were freezing in place, out of fuel, out of drivetrain. In the weeks that followed, the roads running west filled up with Panthers and King Tigers abandoned very nearly intact, hatches open, waiting for recovery vehicles and spare final drives that no longer existed anywhere in Germany. The American columns, meanwhile, never stopped arriving. That, in a single winter image, is the entire argument of this story. The most feared tanks in Europe parked in the snow, the mocked ones still moving, and the reject was not finished. 5 years later, in the summer of 1950, Shermans of the same family, with the same hull line and the same 18-liter heart, rolled off ships into Korea and traded fire with T-34-85s in an entirely different war, on the other side of the world, against an enemy nobody in Dearborn had ever imagined. The 4 amputated cylinders even got their revenge. Ford eventually rebuilt the design back into a 12 to power American heavy tank prototypes at the end of the war. The V-12 that the Air Corps rejected came back as a tank engine after all. And when the armies finally moved on, civilians picked up where the war left off. To this day, at tractor pulls across the American Midwest, engine blocks torn out of surplus Shermans thunder down dirt tracks, tuned by hobbyists to horsepower figures that Ford's own engineers never dared write down. 80-year-old aluminum, still refusing to die, still overbuilt for every job anybody gives it. As for Cobra King itself, the story is almost too neat to be true. It was knocked out at last in March of 1945 on a deep raid into Germany that went badly. It was abandoned where it stopped, and then it was simply forgotten. For 6 decades, that hull sat as an anonymous gate guard at American bases in Germany, painted and repainted, walked past every single day by soldiers who had no idea what they were looking at. A piece of scenery, something to photograph on your first week in country. In 2008, a chaplain's hunch and a historian's detective work matched the serial numbers. Today, the actual hull, scars intact, stands inside the National Museum of the United States Army in Virginia, where anyone who wants to can walk up and put a hand on the machine that broke the ring at Bastogne. So here is the verdict. Start with what did not make this tank force unstoppable, because the list is instructive. Not the gun. It was outranged for most of the campaign, and every crew in Normandy could tell you so. Not the armor. Lovelady's men watched 3 rounds bounce off a Panther and could tell you exactly what the armor was worth. Not even, strictly speaking, the horsepower. 500 was nothing extraordinary on paper. What made it unstoppable was the margin. An engine designed to survive the sky, demoted to stroll the earth, simply could not be worn out by anything a ground war was capable of doing to it. And Detroit repeated that overbuilt miracle more than 20,000 times, in interchangeable copies, so that the margin did not belong to one lucky crew. It belonged to every column in the theater. But look one more time at the quotation marks around the word mistake in our title, because they were earned. The mistake was real, and a mistake, by itself, wins nothing. Rolls-Royce had brilliant accidents. Germany had brilliant accidents. Every industrial nation in that war produced good ideas that arrived at the wrong desk on the wrong day. What decided this was the system standing around the mistake. A system with second sources, so that a spurned contract could walk down the street to Packard and come back 4 years later as the heart of the Mustang. A system with idle capacity and paid-for tooling, so that an orphaned aircraft design could be cut in half and given honest work. A system humble enough to hold its newest engine at home while instructors beat the faults out of it, to test 5 rivals against each other and let the data pick the winner, and to admit in public that its tanks were burning and then fix the actual reason while the war was still going on. One stubborn old man's worst decision produced 2 war-winning engines, one in the sky, one in the mud. Not because he was wise, because everything built around his decision was designed to catch what he dropped. Germany's finest engineering produced a Predator that could kill anything it met, and could not reliably get to the meeting, because nothing around it was built to catch anything at all. That is the verdict. American tankers, by the end of the war, passed around a saying they attributed to a captured German officer. That one German tank was worth 10 American tanks, but the Americans always brought the 11th. No historian has ever found the German who said it. He did not need to exist. The readiness tables said it for him. The 11th tank always came. It came because of 2 dimensions sketched out of spite in 1940, because of a saw taken to a dead design in 1942, because of a factory on Warren Avenue that had been building warplane hearts since the previous World War and never entirely stopped. And it came up a frozen road outside Assenois, carrying 5 young men who had no idea they were riding the punchline to a story about an old man's temper. Unstoppable never meant unhittable. The 4 burning Shermans on that road knew better than anyone. It meant the column always rolled at dawn. War is engineering. But the men who rode behind that engine were not components. They had names. Boggess, Dickerman, Murphy, Smith, and Hafner. And they deserved to be remembered by them.